hit the button.
Okay. So, do you do any kind of introduction, or should I just go?
I was just going to say, welcome this morning, everybody. This is Rabbi Min Kantrowitz. We're so glad to have Rabbi Min with us today, and I'm going to let you just introduce yourself further and take it from here.
Okay, great. Well, I'm glad to be here with you all. I am based in Albuquerque, but since the days of Zoom, I've got students and folks scattered far and wide, like most people do, and that's wonderful. I am not the rabbi of a congregation. I never wanted to do that. I always considered my rabbinate to be one of personal connections. And so that's the way it's been. And if anyone has other questions, I'll be glad to answer them. One of the other things I do in addition to a whole lot of varied teaching is to teach for Rhodes Scholar Elder Hostel, particularly about the B'nai Anusim of northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, because people are fascinated and come from all over the country, 20, 30 people almost every month to learn about this wonderful particular phenomenon. But we are here to talk about Parshat Tzav, which, when the mitzvah kids find out that this is their Torah portion, they roll their eyes and say, oh, why do I have to get this? Why do I have to, can I just like pick another one that has more action or is not full of all of this detail that I'm not interested in, etc. None of those action-packed ones, but it turns out to be fascinating once you dig into it a little bit. Because, when you look at it just on the surface, I'm going to pause because we need to say the bracha before studying Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Now we can talk. So Tzav, as many of you know, is the second Torah portion in Leviticus. Leviticus Vayikra was introduced last week, and it is really the central part of the whole Chumash, of the whole 5 books of Moses. Many people say that the first 2 books are leading up to Leviticus, and then the 2 books that follow Leviticus are kind of a denouement after. And that really follows the kind of chiastic structure that is characteristic of biblical poetry and biblical literature. The most important part is in the middle. And that may be why it used to be a tradition when you were teaching kids Torah, you would start with Leviticus, which was always a mystery until you kind of realize that that's kind of how they had structured literature at that time. So that's a little digression. One of the things that is interesting is that when people are first reading about these offerings, it tends to read as if it's in a flip way, is like vending machine Judaism. You put in this particular thing and you get out, voila, the result that you had been praying for or sacrificing for in a one-to-one correspondence. But that's really not how it is. Because we know that when we ask for something, we don't always get what we want, to quote the Rolling Stones. So there are several particular things that are interesting to me about this Torah portion. And I'll just give you like 5 or 6 of them, and then we'll talk about them. One of them is what it's called Tzav, which means command. And it's interesting. It starts out by saying God spoke to Moses, saying, command Aaron and his sons to do these particular rituals. Now, God didn't command Aaron directly. He talked to Moses, and he told Moses, you go do it. You command Aaron. Why was it, I wonder, that God didn't command Aaron? God certainly had the capability of commanding Aaron. So that's one question that we should delve into a little bit. A couple of other interesting things. I want to talk about the word Tzav, because Tzav, meaning command, assumes that there's a commander and a commandee. The word command assumes relationship, assumes connection. The word mitzvah has within it the shorish, the root, tzav. So when you put a mem in front of a verb in Hebrew, it turns the verb into a noun. So mitzvah can be that which is commanded. Or looking at tzav as connection, that which is a connection. So when people ask, well, what's a mitzvah? Often people will mistranslate it as a good deed. Yeah, nothing wrong with good deeds, but that's not what the word really means. If you really take it apart, the vav in the word mitzvah is a connection, just like the word command is a connection. The vav looks like a crochet hook. And in fact, that's how it functions. It's not the word and, it doesn't exist as a separate word in Hebrew. You put a vav in front of the word and it means and whatever the noun comes next and whatever. So vav is a connection. So a mitzvah I translate as a divine commandment to connect with God through action. Through action, because you can't just think a mitzvah. A mitzvah has got to be something that you do. So a mitzvah is a divine commandment to connect with God through action. And when I'm preparing people, whatever age, for their bar bat mitzvah, that is the connection that they make between bar mitzvah. Oh, this is a whole long list of commandments and things that I'm supposed to do now that I'm a fountain pen, whatever. They, once they realize that there's got to be some action, then the concept of doing a bar mitzvah project starts to make sense. Okay. There are several things in this Torah portion that are, actually most of it, describing things that we no longer do. All of these sacrifices, which I prefer to call offerings, because in English, in American society, we think about it, a sacrifice, especially in a religious context, as, you know, killing something with great drama, often a human. In fact, I had someone ask me last week, shockingly, when did Jews stop doing human sacrifice? I went, what? What do you mean, when did Jews stop doing human sacrifice? We never did. But the use of the word sacrifice in the language leads people to go down that pathway. So I use the word offerings. So the word for what happened in the temple when these animals were brought to the temple ritually and slaughtered ritually is not in Hebrew sacrifices or even offerings, but korbanot. Korbanot is a plural word. Korban is the singular. And it comes from the Hebrew root karava, which means to be close. To be close. And so these ritual offerings were within the cultural context of ancient Israel, the way that people attempted to get close to divine energy. So in my modern thinking, I said, well, why would killing an animal, especially one that might have been valuable, why might that have allowed people to feel closer to divine energy? And I think it's because of the very close connection between ritual slaughter and our own lives and deaths. When we are close to a death, whether it's a loved one or someone we didn't know, or when we're around someone who is gravely ill, we feel a sense of the thin line between life and death. And when that happens, we're much more appreciative of the miracle of being alive, of the miracle that we're breathing, of the miracle that our blood is flowing, usually appropriately. And so the time of this great, hubbub of hundreds of people offering, and the sound of these animals being slaughtered, and the blood and the guts, and the odors, and the chaos must have been an incredible opportunity for people to say, whoa, very fine line between life and death. And what is being offered is an offering of gratitude. I'm grateful to be alive. Now, whether the particular offering is about sin or about guilt, those are categories, but the categories, if you dig underneath them, are really talking about the same thing. They're really talking about, how do I get right with God? How do I put myself on a path toward truth, toward peace, toward reconciliation, toward ethical behavior? How do I use this as an opportunity to do deep self-examination? So what is often, I think, on a deeper level being offered is the result of deep self-examination. When we give ourselves the gift of saying, okay, I gotta do a spiritual check-in with myself. How am I doing? How's my connection? When we do that, I think the result is to offer up what we've learned toward self-improvement. And not only self-improvement in an ethical dimension, which I think is important, but also self-improvement in terms of increased connection, increased opportunities for connection. Pause for comments and questions. Not yet. Okay.
Well, I did have one kind of question.
Yeah.
What you were saying about when people were doing offerings and it brought them to that line of life and death. And I can really relate to that. I can imagine that on the one hand. And then on the other, it makes me wonder, I mean, they had to be slaughtering animals for survival too, right? I mean, they were eating animals on a regular basis. So somehow, if there had to be a difference, right? I mean, and I would think if they were slaughtering animals on a regular basis for survival, then what would like how would they make that a very different experience, you know?
Yeah, a couple of ways. First of all, it wasn't like they were slaughtering animals in their backyard, which they would normally do. They were bringing these animals to the temple. There were specific areas in the temple where the slaughter was to be done. It was to be done with other people, in front of other people. And some of these offerings were burnt completely. The Olah offering, for example, was burnt completely. No one ever ate it. It was truly an offering, the reach nechoach, the pleasing odor of the barbecuing meat was really what was being offered. In some of the other sacrifices, the meat went to feed the priests because the priests were not allowed to own land. So how could they feed their families? So the priests got some of the meat from some of the sacrifices. So it was done for holy purpose. The other thing is that we have until this day a commandment to not eat blood. That's why if you're preparing kosher meat, you salt it and soak it to get rid of the blood. We don't eat blood sausage. We don't ingest blood. And because blood is a symbol of life. And in fact, I'm on the Chevra Kadisha in Albuquerque, the group of people that prepares bodies for burial, according to Jewish tradition. And if we are working with a person's body and some of their blood has ended up on the sheet, for example, that they were brought in with when they were brought in for us to prepare them, the blood on that sheet is cut out. That piece of bloody sheet goes into the coffin with them because it's associated with life, and everything that is associated with life goes into the coffin with them. So the prohibition against eating blood is, on and on and on forever. Very interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Wasn't there a time that we didn't eat meat, that we were strictly vegetarians? And didn't that have something to do with before the sacrifices or something? Or that
in Genesis, in the beginning of Genesis, we were vegetarians, and then a little bit later on in Genesis, and I can't give you the particular quote, we were then allowed to eat meat, but originally we were vegetarians. And it's interesting because Rav Kook, who was the first chief rabbi of Israel, was a vegetarian. And so here he is, the hotshot rabbi of the new state of Israel, advocating vegetarianism. It's very interesting. He was also somewhat of a mystic as well. So, okay. Circling back, the garments that are described as being worn are also the same garments that we use in the Chevra Kadisha when we're preparing people for burial. The liturgy for that says things like, you should put on the holy linen tunic, which is exactly the kind of white burial garments that were used at the time of the temple by the priests. Very interesting. The ritual garments then would have not remained all nice and white and clean. They would have had to be washed and prepared all over again. And yet we're told that if you're going to perform this holy act of attempting to get closer to God through this act of slaughtering an animal or bringing a meal offering in a ritual way, then you had to dress up according to the importance of the ritual. So going into that clean is also a metaphor for us going into ritual spaces as clean as we can be physically, washing hands, going to the mikveh, as clean as we can be emotionally. We ask for forgiveness for people we might have harmed, traditionally not only on Yom Kippur, but also on Rosh Chodesh, each new moon. There's actually some liturgy called Yom Kippur Katan, the little Yom Kippur, or every new moon, Rosh Chodesh. The same kind of prayers that we do every Friday night before Shabbat, and actually every night before we go to bed. The Shema al Hamitah, the Shema that we say in the bed at night before we go to sleep, is asking for forgiveness. So we want to be spiritually clean, we want to be emotionally clean, we want to be physically clean. And that's just another interesting thing. I want you to talk a little bit about some of the remnants of the sacrificial system that are still around in normative Jewish practices today. So, few examples. The Ner Tamid, which is mentioned in our Torah portion. Now, the literal translation of Ner Tamid is candle always. We call it the eternal light. And it comes from this part of Leviticus 6 where it talks about the fire shall be kept burning. And that's really interesting because in today's synagogues, we have usually an electrical light. Now, someone's got to change that bulb when it burns out. So it's not always on. Try to change it quickly when it does burn out, but it's not always on. Some synagogues have a solar Ner Tamid, so it's not using electricity, and so it might be on all the time. But in fact, if you think about what was happening at the time of the temple, the way a fire is kept burning is by someone paying attention all the time. The fire is getting low, got to add some more fuel to it. It had to be someone's responsibility or shared responsibility to make sure that that light, that fire, is kept burning. So rather than calling it an eternal light, perhaps it would be more appropriate to call it a perpetual light, a light that keeps going, a fire that keeps going. Now, for us, since we don't have that, we have this symbolic replacement of that in the little lamp that is above the ark where the Torah scrolls are kept. And to make it more personal, there are many who say, well, really, the light that we're talking about is our own internal light. The tradition says that each of us has a spark of God in us. Nitzotz Elohut is the term, a spark of godness or godliness within us. And that the Ner Tamid reminds us to pay attention to that spark, to make sure it is kept burning, that illumination. And there's a tradition that says that when someone dies, their spark gets passed on to all the people who knew them. And so if you've lost a loved one, you have a little bit of their spark. And then it's up to you to figure out how to tend that spark so it can continue throughout the world. It's a very interesting way of saying, how do we take this piece of this ancient ritual with the priests trying to keep the fire burning and have it bring it to today, to something that is meaningful and personal for us today. So there are several other remnants, specific remnants of the priestly system that have been incorporated into normative American Jewish practice, in addition to the Ner Tamid. We wash our hands before we eat, not simply just to cleanse them, but also because the priests washed their hands before they offered an offering. So we're doing exactly the same thing. When we make bread, the baker takes a little piece of the bread dough and burns it to represent the meal offering sacrifices. Now, the most interesting example that I've heard of this, if you look at a box of matzah, it says challah is taken. And that's what they're referring to, that in the preparation of that matzah, the baker took a little piece of the dough and threw it into the back of the oven to burn it as a symbolic meal sacrifice. But not too long ago, I was talking to a gentleman in a small town in northern New Mexico, Hispanic, Catholic, northern New Mexico. And he said, my abuela, my grandmother, when she made tortillas, would always take a little piece of the tortilla dough and throw it into the back of the oven. And I said, very interesting. Talk to her about that. And he said, yeah, I asked her. And she had no idea. She said, that's how you make tortillas. There's no other way to make tortillas. Very interesting.
Yes.
So that piece of the ancient sacrifice ritual has morphed through time to northern New Mexico. Who knows? But it is certainly on every matzah box. We don't eat any blood, and in fact, the word that we use is treif for non-kosher meat. But the word treif doesn't mean non-kosher. The word treif means torn. And so it comes from the prohibition against eating animals that died through violence. Okay.
Animals that died from what? Sorry?
Violence.
Oh, violence.
Violence. Animals that were torn in their deaths, as opposed to the kosher shechita process of the sharpest possible knife and the quickest possible death, etc. The fact that we use 2 chalot traditionally on Shabbat represents the showbreads that were used in offerings at the time of the temple. The fact that we traditionally have 3 prayer services every day, Shachrit, Mincha, and Mariv, represents the 3 times a day that the sacrifices were offered, that the offerings were done at the time of the temple. So it actually says, I think somewhere in the Talmud, I can't find the citation, one who studies the laws of sacrifice is as if he had brought an offering to the temple. And so we're renewing and replacing some of these rituals in our everyday practice. So I was wondering about whether a sacrifice is the same as an offering. If you think about the offering systems as like really visceral interactions and sacred rituals, it doesn't only bring worshipers closer to God, it also brings the community members into contact with each other. Maybe what this was really functioning as was an opportunity for community building. When people are in close contact with each other and the scene is very dramatic, they are literally physically getting close to each other. And so maybe one of the functions of that system was coming nearer to each other as a way of saying coming nearer to the holiness of community. It's a stretch, but that's okay. One of the reasons we are still wrestling with Torah is because our culture and our circumstances are different now, and yet it's all still relevant when seen through slightly different eyes. I really think about these offerings as an attempt, a communal and an individual attempt to rebalance what was unbalanced in the world. Both individually, the sin offerings and the guilt offerings, for example, were attempts to rebalance that sense of I've done wrong. And whether intentionally or unintentionally, these offerings were a kind of spiritual technology to try to rebalance those things that were off balance. And interestingly enough, the people who brought those two offerings, some of them were trying to atone for things they had intentionally done wrong, and some of them were trying to atone for things they had unintentionally done wrong. But they all were doing this together. So you couldn't tell. There was no way to tell who had sinned intentionally and who had sinned unintentionally. And I thought, what a brilliant way to not point fingers at people in community. What an amazing way to say, we are in here as a collective, and we are going to respect the privacy of your process by not pointing out who did what. And I was contrasting that to what happened actually during the Inquisition, when people who had been let out of Inquisition jails and then marched in front of the judges before the decision was made whether or not to burn them at the stake, they were given different kinds of garments to wear. And the garments branded them as heretics, and branded them as heretics who were so severely transgressing the laws that they were certainly going to be put to death. Or maybe the other garment indicated that maybe what they did was not so bad, they maybe just had to pay a big fine. But the fact that what they wore was public to the whole community, this is what I did. And that's actually what happened at the early stages of America, when people were put in the stocks in the middle of the central square. Look, this person is guilty of XYZ. And how wonderful that in the Jewish tradition, even in ancient times, the idea of the possibility of atonement without public humiliation was possible and was practiced. This, by the way, also is Shabbat HaGadol. So there's several big Shabbats during the year. Shabbat HaGadol is the one that happens just before Pesach, and which is coming awfully soon. And there's a custom of reciting the Haggadah in the afternoon of Shabbat HaGadol, so that people would be familiar with its contents and be prepared for the Seder. It's also called Shabbat HaGadol because in the Haftarah for today, we read, I will send the prophet Elijah before you, the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. So of the Shabbat HaGadol V'Hanorah, the great and awesome day. So we read part of the Haggadah, and that's I think, a connection between slavery and freedom. So if Tzav is really about connecting, it's us connecting with God. It's connecting the history of slavery with the history and the upcoming celebration of freedom. And it reminds us that we are potentially always in a state of gratitude. When people talk today about making a sacrifice, often what they're talking about is giving up something, often money, or something that has monetary value to them. And in a way, that's what was happening at the time of the temple. Certainly taking a large mammal that would have fed your family or the families around you for a while and bringing it to the temple and having it be slaughtered and maybe not being able to eat from the animal at all was a big sacrifice in the sense that we use the word sacrifice today. But I think really underneath that, there's the question of what are we giving? What are we symbolically giving up? What are we symbolically deciding how we're going to give thanks? And I think it is to demonstrate our caring. You know, a symbolic gift of animals from our flock is kind of different than putting a couple of coins in the tzedakah box before Shabbat. So I think a serious question for us is, what are we willing to offer in gratitude for all that we have? Often it's not something that we think about seriously. It will, write a check at tax time or write a check at the end of the year and count it up at tax time in order to say, okay, well, I've fulfilled my sense of obligation to demonstrate my concern for other people or my gratitude for being alive, healthy, living in a free country, etc., by writing this check. But perhaps it would be more meaningful if we thought about what it is that we actually do when we decide to share with other people, when we decide to spend a Shabbat morning in prayer rather than at the mall. What is it that we are connecting through our actions with the holy purpose of our tradition, which is all about love, all about interpersonal connection, all about personal responsibility, all about self-examination, all about self-care and care of the community. And all of those things require a very different attitude toward life and a very different set of actions in the world than what contemporary American culture is urging us to celebrate. So I will pause because I've been talking nonstop for 40 minutes, and I am interested in any of your thoughts about any of this.
I'd like to know, you had mentioned at the beginning why God directed, was it Aaron No, tell Moses to tell Aaron to give sacrifices, and he didn't do it himself. You said you would return to that, so I'm reminding you.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Well, first of all, Moses, we are told, had some kind of speech impediment. And what that was, whether it was real or whether it was not, we don't really know. But Aaron ended up being the leader of the priestly class. And at some point, I think the decision was made to say, just because someone seems to be favored doesn't mean that they can take on responsibility. And when I look at those early stories, I think, oh, Moses, the story is all about him, and he's the hero, and he had challenges, and he overcame those challenges. But he wasn't perfect. And in fact, in Jewish tradition, nobody's perfect. There isn't such a thing as perfection in Judaism. We are always self-correcting. We're always self-examining. And so to pass over Moses was appropriate. Say, Aaron, you can do it. You can be the mouthpiece, but also you have a different set of leadership capabilities than Moshe did. So that's my take on it.
I have a problem with a lot of Leviticus. I think some of the things that you've explained today are wonderful regarding how it should have relevance for us today. But I've always been bothered by setting apart a group of Jews supposedly elevated above the remaining Jews. There might have been a valid reason, I suppose, for God to do it back then, several thousand years ago. But we've moved so far in this society away from that. For example, in this parsha, God gives instructions for Aaron and his sons, all the males, none of the females in the family. And yet today we elevate women just like we do men in all sorts of positions, including the rabbinate and the cantorial class, etc. Can't we move beyond that? We still, in many congregations, always give the first aliyah to somebody who maintains that they're a Kohen, even though I would postulate there's absolutely no way anybody today can validate that they're a descendant from the clan of Aaron. So I guess I just have a real problem with that. If we're going to move away in some ways from some of these rituals or authorities, why can't we move away from the others?
Well, great question. And I guess the short answer is, I think we are moving away from the others. I mean, the fact that in many congregations, they don't do the first three aliyot by Kohen, Levi, Israel. They will just say, come up for an aliyah. Right. In some congregations, they do group aliyot rather than calling up someone to say, okay, call up, Moshe ben David. They might go Moshe ben David Usara, naming both the mother and the father. Or they might have 5 people coming up for an aliyah that is thematically related to what is being read in that piece of the parsha. To make things even more contemporary, there's been some discussions recently about how to call someone up from the Torah if they're non-binary, if they don't identify as either male or female. Right, your eyes open. What do you do in that situation, right? And it's happening. So I'll give you the specific citation. In 2022, the Conservative Movement Committee on Law and Standards passed a tshuva, or I not passed, but published a tshuva, published a rabbinic response to how should non-binary individuals be called to the Torah. And they wrestled with the issue, and they cited all the pieces of Talmud that might or might have not done anything. They have pieces of the Shulchan Aruch that they cited, etc. And they came up with a solution to call people up with the phrase "Na la'amod," please stand, please rise, rather than calling people up using some very specifically gendered expression. Now, this is the conservative movement, which is usually fairly conservative. And is the Orthodox movement going to do that? I don't know that they're going to do that, but they now have a rabbinical school for women. And it's called Yeshivat Maharat. The women who graduate from that program get the same training as Orthodox rabbis. Some of them don't take the title rabbi. Some of them take the title rabbah, which is an invented title. Some of them take the title Maharat, which is from an acronym that means Master of Law and Jewish Law and Teaching, or something like that. But in fact, they are educationally equivalent. And many of those women are being hired by Orthodox congregations, either as teachers, administrators, or in some cases, spiritual leaders. So change is happening. But when you've got a 6,000 or a 5,000 or a 3,000-year-old tradition, it's never fast enough when it's your concern and your time. Other comments, questions? Yeah, sure.
So this might be a dumb question, but so because I did not know that traditionally Jews were vegetarian up through Genesis there. So were they performing offerings while they were vegetarian? I mean, for thousands of years. I mean, how did that all happen?
So from what I can tell, the system of offerings at the temple happened much later than that. So in the early in Genesis time, they were not slaughtering animals.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't happen until the temple.
And then what made them change? I mean, I know you said God told them they could eat meat, but why? Why would that have changed? I mean,
I don't have an answer to that question. It might be that we can't know the mind of God, but but it might be that the process of investing in the raising of animals rather than the raising of agricultural products did something to people's sensibilities so that the animals had greater emotional value or psychological value, so that offering something of value changed when what was valued changed. But I don't know. If someone else has a better answer, I would love to hear it.
The only thing I can perhaps add is that when they were agricultural people, they were tied to the land.
Mm-hmm.
But Jews have had a difficult time throughout history being tied to specific property because other peoples, et cetera, have moved them around or evicted them or whatever. It's much easier if you have animals. Animals you can take with you, but you can't take farmland with you.
Right.
You either keep it or you lose it.
Good. Thank you.
thank you. Mhm.
Other comments or questions?
Yeah, I just was thinking about the notion of sacrifice, and you made some really good points, but I've always thought of sacrifice as the surrendering somehow, and it's not just material, as the surrendering of one's personal plans or hopes for oneself, and in the short or the long term. So for sacrifice, when we do a sacrifice, it's like saying, I'm not thinking about myself. I'm going to release that whole sort of planning and hoping and whatever that I had for myself to be given to God and to the community. So there's an element of connection through surrendering of what is really personally valuable. So and it ties to this notion of animal sacrifice. If you think of an animal as guaranteeing some kind of wealth for you, or some kind of, or protein in the near future, by giving that up, you are in fact joining the community and God, by letting others and God make the plan for you. Do you know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. What it reminds me of is there's this Hasidic concept called bitul hayesh. So yesh means to have something. If you have something, you'd say yesh li. I have a pen. Yesh li. I have. It belongs to me. I have it. And there's a concept that what one should be working toward in one's life is non-attachment.
Yeah.
It's almost in a Buddhist way.
Yes.
Bitul hayesh, to eliminate, to erase the wanting, and that's a very powerful concept, because if we really say, as we do on Shabbat, we leave out a lot of the prayers of the Amidah on Shabbat. The ones we leave out are the ones that are asking for things, because the concept is on Shabbat, we have everything we need. And so that's a really direct connection between that and getting rid of or erasing the wanting, the desiring. Because in fact, if we have everything we need, there's nothing that we want. And we can live in gratitude.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here. First of all, Rabbi, I appreciate it very much. Really interesting. Kind of on a side note, but just a comment you made kind of struck a chord, because I question it myself. You mentioned the heritage of Judaism, or whatever you're referring to as being 6,000 or 5,000 or 3,000 years old. What's your take on that? I mean, why is it that we're so unaware of?
Judaism, in my mind,
origin?
is an eternally changing process. And so to say at point X, we're going to call this collection of processes, this collection of practices, Judaism, is an interesting question. At what point do we call a collection of processes, draw a line around it, a border around it, and say, this is now a religion as opposed to a cultural practice? The Canaanites had cultural practices. The Babylonians had cultural practices. The Assyrians had cultural practices. And those got changed through time and through population shifts. And at what point can we, sitting here in 2023, decide, okay, now it's Judaism, as opposed to, oh, well, the Babylonians did that, but we don't. It's interesting, if you study the history of religions, most of the more modern religions had a kind of start point, and they started out by differentiating their practices from the practices of the people surrounding them. we did the same thing. All the stuff in the Bible about don't worship the pillars. That's because people were worshiping the pillars. And so to differentiate Jewish practice from non-Jewish practice, our scriptures say, don't worship the pillars. Beginnings of Christianity did the same thing. Don't worship on Saturday, worship on Sunday. You don't need to keep kosher to keep this religion. Do it our way. If you look at the history of the beginning of the development of the formal religions, they all started out by differentiating from the cultural practices in which they were embedded at the time. So that's why I can't give you a date.
Thank you.
Interesting.
You know, you mentioned don't worship the pillars or the Hebrew saying that. Someone had mentioned that as far as this temple's concerned to me. And it's, why are we doing this? You know, are we just worshiping the pillars? And I just, I was a little taken by that. And I just thought, no, there's energy inside these pillars. And there's, you know, and that's what this is right now. It's this continuation of that 140-year. Anyway, I don't mean to digress, but.
Right. You know, I don't think that honoring and venerating a building which has been dedicated to holy purpose for a long time is anything like worshiping the pillars. Because the people who were worshiping the pillars really thought that the pillars were God. And they would leave, you know, meat offerings on the pillars to say, okay, God, well, you must be hungry. Take this. I don't see anyone doing anything like that with Temple Aaron.
Yeah, no, I was surprised that that was even mentioned to me.
Yeah.
It kind of took me by surprise, but anyway, thank you.
Yeah.
What you were saying about the word yesh and talking about I have, like, it makes me wonder about your name, Yeshim. Is there significance with that?
No, it means in Turkish it means jade, and I think it's long time ago my mother told me that it's when her father had to be, my grandfather had to be placed in, well, that's another story, in Afghanistan, in Kabul during the Second World War. But it was a way that my grandmother actually got him out of Turkey because the Turks and the Nazis were collaborating. So she used her connections to get him there during the Second World War, so he wouldn't be, you know, because he was in the military. But it's a long story, but that's where she learned about Yeshim. And when I went and worked in Pakistan after 9/11, I heard people using Yeshim as jade too. So I think it means like, yeah, jade and pretty. It's not Hebrew. My first name is actually Yashar, which also is one of those Hebrew and Turkish names. Yeah, but I've used Yeshim more.
That's
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
Yeah, names are really interesting. I'll tell you a short story about my first name, because people, you know, they hear
Yeah.
Min. Sometimes they spell it M-I-N-H, you know, like the
Yeah,
Vietnamese way. So, no.
I was wondering that too, Min. Yeah.
I just figured it was short for something or
So
something.
here's the story. I was named after my father's mother, whose name was Minnie, and she died when he was a youngster. So I was the firstborn, so they wanted to name me after her. But they said, Minnie, what an old-fashioned name. We can't name a little child Minnie. We'll give her a modern name. So they named me Muriel.
Oh,
I have a twin sister. She could not pronounce Muriel. The closest she could come was Minnie Nu.
oh my gosh.
So Minnie Nu got shortened to Minnie, and Minnie got shortened to Min. And I had my name legally changed to Min.
Oh, wow.
That would be the end of the story, except the first time I went to Israel, I knew, you know, 7 words of Hebrew. And someone said to me, Ma Shemech, what's your name? And I very proudly said, Shemi, Min, my name is Min. And they started laughing hysterically. And I didn't know why, but apparently in colloquial Israeli Hebrew, Min means sex.
Oh, great.
So I had just
Oh.
said, my name is sex.
Oh, boy.
And so if I'm in Israel, I use the name Mina, which is a fairly common name, and it's close enough.
Oh, my God. Yeah, I was gonna say Muriel is sounding a lot better, huh?
Yeah. And the irony is I ended up with the name I was meant to get anyway, my father's name,
Wow,
right?
that's funny.
Good.
Well, this is great.
Well, I want to wish everyone a Zissen Pesach, as they say, a happy Passover. And, may you all find that little piece of freedom that you didn't even know you needed.
Okay.
You too.
Thank you.
Thank you
This
so
was
much.
lovely. Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, and nice to meet you all.
Shalom, everybody. Thank you. It's been very good.